I'm your host, Farzin Irani. Let's connect the dots. "2025 was quite a year, so we decided to share the highlights reel of our favorite moments on the podcast. Let's relive the best of 2025.
Well, it's not high on the news, but the Federal Reserve is insolvent. And the reason it's insolvent is because the liabilities exceed the assets. Now, that doesn't mean insolvent doesn't mean to say bankrupt. So insolvency is just a technical term meaning liabilities exceed assets. But if it was a corporation, like a typical corporation, they might well be and probably would be forced into bankruptcy in such a situation where they liquidate all the assets, pay off the creditors. Now, that's not going to happen to the Federal Reserve because they got several trillion of. By the way, they're in the. I haven't got the figure that they're in the hole to now. It's in the probably in the hundreds of billions, but I haven't got the figure. That's the negative asset. It could be a trillion, but they've got 2 trillion of cash circulating, physical banknotes. Now, those banknotes are never going to come in and say, give us something in exchange. So there's no real danger of everybody queuing up at the front door of the Federal Reserve and saying, give me my money back, and then it can't pay the bills because its assets aren't enough. So the 2 reasons it's gone into this problem are, the first one and the biggest one is all the government bonds which it bought during the pandemic when the interest rates were very low. Now, the price of those government bonds today is a lot less than when they bought them. And the difference is sufficiently huge to already wipe out the capital and reserves of the Federal Reserve, which is only about $40 billion, completely wipe it out. So that's wiped it out in just the decline in value. Now, there's an argument that if these bonds are held to maturity, they'll come back to 100 at maturity. Then they will. So it's not such a big problem.
Yeah, because they don't mark to market. If they don't mark to market,
they're not marked to market. But if they had to sell those bonds, they wouldn't get 100% today because the interest rate is lower than what you can get on an equivalent bond. That's the first reason. The second problem is that, and it's starting to rectify itself gradually, but it's not rectified yet. A couple of years ago, they put the interest rate up from 0, effectively in the United States, to 5%. And what that meant was that all the depositors with the Federal Reserve, which is money market funds and the banks, would earn money market rates of interest, 5%, from the Federal Reserve. But the assets of the Federal Reserve, because that's a liability, they've got a deposit, that's a liability, they've got to pay out the interest. But the asset are the bonds they held, they bought, and these bonds were all paying 1 or 2%, way below what they're paying out. So they were paying out month after month, they were paying out a lot more in interest to the depositors than they were earning from the bond portfolio. So up until when they started putting the interest rate up 2 or 3 years ago, the Federal Reserve every week would pay to the Treasury, the government, its surplus. And it was making a surplus. It was a regular, steady payment of billions every month to the Treasury. But when they went into the situation of raising the interest rates, now they had a deficit. So every month, the deficit gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that means they'd be making a loss. And the losses become, it only took a few months, so we're now talking years of losses. After a few months, the loss wiped out their capital reserves. But if you look at their balance sheet, you won't see that loss in the profit and loss account. You'll see that loss reported as an asset. Now, you might find that very odd that a loss could be an asset, but I can tell you that is exactly how it's reported on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And how is that allowed? Well, it's allowed according to the special accounting rules of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve has got a set of accounting rules written, get by guess who? The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. So they
write their own rules, yes.
The accounting to call that loss, that very large loss, call it an asset, or if you like, they call it a negative liability, but it's still wouldn't be allowed in any normal company. That would be accounting fraud, but they could call it an asset. So if you make a loss, it's a debit, and debit assets are all loss. on the profit and loss account, debits are money going out and credits are money coming in. But on the asset side and liability side, liabilities are credits, i.e., they're your creditors, and assets are your debitors, the people who owe you money. So they're taking this asset, this item, which should be a debit on the loss as a debit on your profit loss, and stick it onto the asset side of the balance sheet and calling it an asset. Now that makes no sense from an accounting point of view, but if you want to try and rationalize it, the way of looking at it is like this: because this is money that they don't have to pay to the Treasury because they haven't got it, they can make that much money in the future and not pay it to the Treasury. Therefore, you can call it an asset. It's a bit like in a company making losses, and so it's got tax credits which can be carried forward, and they take those tax credits and call them an asset.
Yes.
Which a buyer might, if you were buying a company with tax credit, you might think you might sort of say, oh, that's an asset to us because we've got profits to offset it. But right now, the Federal Reserve doesn't have any profits to offset against this asset. So, but if they did have profits, then they'd be able to say we don't have to pay the government because we've got to clear this negative liability or this positive asset because we don't have to pay the government until we've got profits over and above our capital reserves. So in a way, it's sort of psychological saying it could be an asset because it's something you don't have to pay to somebody. I don't have to pay you £100, therefore it's an asset. Nonsense, but
crazy. Clive, I put this in I put this in other terms. Clive, I owe you a rabbit, but I might be able to pull out a rabbit out of my hat. So technically I don't owe you a rabbit. Because the central banks can do whatever they want, whenever they want. They can change the rules of the game. As you said, create money out of thin air. And in New Zealand, I think what most people don't get is, because I'm a New Zealand citizen and I get interviewed on a show called Money Talks in New Zealand, I did some research on this a couple of years back. And during COVID, again, most central banks bought bonds of their governments to create extra liquidity so they could flush the system. Fiscal policy, everyone sit at home. We're just going to give you free money because there's a bad virus out there. Now these bonds have turned upside down because obviously as interest rates have gone up, which is what you were explaining, there's a negative correlation. As interest rates start going up, the bond loses value. And on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's website, I don't know the exact term, but technically they said that the loss was accumulated based on the government doing this, and the government had to reimburse them, which I also think, if I'm not mistaken, was the Bank of England's policy.
Yeah.
That wasn't it? But the Bank of England also said, hey, too good, we bought it off you, thank you, we helped you out, but now you owe us the money back because we made a loss on the bonds we bought from you.
That happened about 2 years ago in the UK when I don't know what happened in the COVID or global pandemic, the global financial crisis, but I do know about 2 years ago there was a bond crisis. So gilt-edged securities, those the government bonds, were spiraling down in price, and it was causing a major problem for all the UK pension plans, which had these bonds, but more importantly, and maybe sillily, all these pension plans had gone into some sort of special derivative scheme which enhanced their yields, and that was fine as long as the bonds didn't spiral out of control downwards, and that's what's happening. And the more they spiral out of control, the more people had to sell them, and so the Bank of England was invited to step in to save the system by buying these bonds and being buyer of the last resort to stop them from collapsing. And when that happened, the Bank of England said to the government, but we'll only do it if you guarantee our losses. And the government agreed to do that because they had no choice, of course. They couldn't let the entire UK pension system collapse. So they were indeed guaranteed. And I think the government has used billions and billions, I forget how much it is, I don't want to say the number, but it's a lot of taxpayer money to subsequently reimburse the Bank of England.
And it's the bank. So the government actually bailed out the banks again. This time the central bank, during the global financial crisis, what we had were what we called were bailouts, where the government bailed out the normal banks. This time, indirectly, they've bailed out the central banks. And that's what I'm saying. There's nowhere higher to kick this bucket anymore for the governments. It's always the governments and the taxpayer who's on the hook for this. And as you said, lender of last resort and regulator, which is a conflict of interest.
You know, I used to say to my friends, and I'm going back a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I used to say, I think as far as the financial system is concerned, we're at 5 minutes to midnight. And they would say, no, everything's fine, it's going to go on. You're being over dramatic, Clive. I said, well, that's how I feel. Anyway, these days I say to my friends, I think we're at 5 minutes to midnight. And they say, no, Clive, you got it wrong. 3 minutes to midnight now.
Yeah. Now they're on board because they can finally see it. I think most of us, some of us have the ability to see things before the fact, and we're a bit too early. Doesn't mean we're wrong, but we're a bit too early. And obviously, governments have tried to kick the can down the road. I think one of my guests has previously said they've run out of kicks now. There's no way out.
Can I teach I'll give your listeners the benefit of a lesson I learned, a painful lesson.
Yes, please.
Prior to the global financial crisis, I was reading, we didn't have the internet as much as we have it today. I was reading periodicals like The Economist and the Wall Street Journal. And from time to time, there were articles about the craziness in the US housing market and how people who couldn't possibly afford to borrow money were being lent money with no chance of ever being repaid, and how this was creating a very fragile financial system for those banks and institutions which held the mortgages, because it was subprime mortgages. And I sort of shrugged my shoulders and said, so what? And then I went to look at a few financial institutions, and I looked at their credit book, and they, according to the credit book, their average, the ones I looked at anyway, the average credit rating was a certain level of they called it FICO score, FICO. I don't know even what that stands for, but the below 600 was dangerous and above 800 was 100% safe. And they said, we got a FICO score amongst all the mortgages we lent is 880 or so, way above the safe level and nowhere near the danger level. So I shrugged myself, you know what, the price of the stock's way down. I can buy it because they haven't done any dodgy lending. How wrong was I not to have listened to those warnings? Because that I'm thinking of one particular company, I've forgotten the name now. That particular company which I invested in, thinking there's no problem because that high FICO score, went bankrupt, along with all the banks and everybody else who was in the same situation. So everybody believed they had a high quality credit book on the mortgages, yet I was being told by reputable financial institutions, I don't know if I have journalists in The Economist and other papers, that this is all bollocks. Well, I should have listened to them. So the message to your listeners is, listen to the warnings.
We did this before, Farzin, before most of your audience was born, in the decade of the 1970s. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar in the period 1970 to 1980 declined by 75%. I think past its prologue. I think the next 10 years, we'll see the purchasing power, the absolute purchasing power, not relative, the absolute purchasing power of the U.S. dollar decline by at least 75%. I'm not talking about the U.S. dollar relative to the Australian dollar or the New Zealand dollar or the euro or the pound, but rather the absolute purchasing power. I see the U.S. dollar being roughly competitive with other currencies, but I see absolute decline in the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar mirroring that in the 1970s. The logical consequence of that is that if you view the decade of the 70s, the gold price, gold being a commodity that has historically done well when people are concerned about the maintenance of their purchasing power, the gold price in the decade of the 70s increased 30-fold. I'm not suggesting to you the gold price is going to increase 30-fold. It's already increased 12-fold since the year 2000. But it wouldn't surprise me to see the nominal U.S. dollar quoted gold price increase by a measure that reflects the deterioration of the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar. So a threefold increase in 10 years seems not merely possible, but probable to me.
Yeah. Thanks for that big thesis. You've covered on quite a few things that I aim to discuss with you today. Obviously, the bonds, the interest rate, the financial repression that's coming, and obviously everything else that comes in between those, right? So obviously I wasn't born I was born in 1978, so I wasn't born when the big inflation came about. But my audience is the older generation as well, so they do understand what you're saying. But you talked about the US example, right? The one thing that I'm looking at is back in the 1970s, the US debt when Paul Volcker, obviously there was a lot of inflation, and the Federal Reserve Chairman at the time obviously increased interest rates to fight inflation. I think it went up to 18 or 20. And in New Zealand, I've had a few people tell me it had gone up to at least about 15% out there as well. But in US's case, in that time, the US debt to GDP was about 34 point something percent. I think it was 4.7. So they could do it. They could increase interest rates to fight inflation. And as to your point, we've just crossed $38 trillion of US debt, which is about 120% of debt to GDP. So are you recommending that the US government, obviously you've already said it, you're not recommending, but you think the US government is going to do financial repression by stealing people's future money or buying power, as you said it?
Is that financial repression? I don't know. I think, unfortunately, all of the wrong programs are extremely popular politically. H.L. Mencken once said that the voter almost always gets what he or she wants, usually good and hard. I think, despite the fact that we have a relatively strong economy in the U.S., they're going to lower interest rates. That will signal to savers and investors around the world that the U.S. society doesn't care about the sanctity of the U.S. dollar. It's interesting you bring up Paul Volcker. We had an election in 1980 in the United States, and there was a popular mandate across the country to reduce the size of government. Ronald Reagan came in with that mandate, and within 6 months of his inauguration, he had been effectively emasculated by Congress. He was able to slow the growth of the U.S. government, which turned out to be enough. But the first 2 years were extremely painful. He allowed Paul Volcker to let the market take control of interest rates. Paul Volcker didn't raise the interest rate. He got out of the way. And we had a situation where inflation was 15 or 16%, and savers demanded a 2% or 3% real yield above the rate of inflation. So it was the market itself that took the inflation rate to 18, 19, 20. And that was really, really, really a hard time. You can imagine yourself if the Fed funds rate is 16 and the prime rate is 18.5, that means the first mortgage rate is 19. That was a really interesting time. But within 2 years, they broke the back of inflationary expectation. They handled the deterioration of the US dollar. And as a consequence of, while they didn't cut government expenditures, they reduced the rate of government growth. When the period of lower interest rates commenced in 1982, that kicked off a 12 or 14-year period where the U.S. economy grew at an absolutely breakneck pace. And they were able to enjoy spectacular economic growth. Unfortunately, they didn't use that period to reduce debt. You might remember that the Republican administrations at that time coined a phrase that says the deficit doesn't matter, which is what we're finding out today. At the same time, in New Zealand popular culture brought in a Labour politician, Roger Douglas, who, unlike many of his fellow countrymen, could add and subtract. He looked at the budget in New Zealand, he looked at the economy and said, what I'm saying today, the math doesn't math. And I think it was probably only a Labour politician in New Zealand that could have accomplished what Roger Douglas did. I had the good fortune to spend some time with him. And while it pains me to say I admire any politician ever, I admired Roger Douglas. He was...
You're not going to be popular for saying that.
You know, in particular because he came to the right policy conclusions from the left, which is not what I would have expected. But, clearly he was a kind-hearted human and wanted well for his country.
Don't you think politics has changed quite a lot? Okay, let's probably not go into politics, because I think the politicians we get nowadays, and I've openly said this when I get interviewed and on these podcasts as well, I think some of our politicians are just brain dead because they can't work out 2 + 2 = 4, and they just think this gravy train is going to last forever. If we run our households like the way governments run the country, I think we'd end up in jail or we'd be broke by now, right? So, because first of all, they counterfeit money, the central banks and the governments in cahoots, and then they expect us to pay taxes for money that can be created out of thin air. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you can go further back to your career as a banker. Would you, if the U.S. government didn't have battleships and nuclear bombs, if they didn't have the ability to counterfeit money and pay you back, would you lend them money? If they have $150 trillion in liability against $167 trillion in assets, where their debt is growing by $4 trillion a year, and their income is only $5 trillion a year before their expenses, I mean, there's just no way you would do it. This is just simple arithmetic.
It's a trick. It's an accounting trick that they're playing, and I think I've mentioned it quite a few times as well. I don't know about the New Zealand government because before I was born or younger, but as I've said, most governments never, ever end up paying off their debt. They just have to roll over the debt and make sure that the government or a superannuation fund or somebody else out there is going to buy their debt and can be rolled over because they never, ever pay it back. And the problem, as I've already told my audiences, and when I get interviewed on Money Talks, for 2 years, I have told them there could be sovereign defaults coming. Now, you said maybe America doesn't default in the normal fashion, but I actually think Europe and Japan, those are the two problem areas where we might actually have a sovereign default incoming. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, they say with regards to Japan, it doesn't matter because the Japanese own their own debt. That's not true. The Japanese say we owe it to ourselves. By the way, that's become an increasingly common phrase in the United States. But that's not true. The spenders owe it to the savers. Unfortunately, in democracy, there's always more spenders than there are savers. We have a little animal in the United States called a coyote, cute little thing, but they eat everything they get near. And there's a joke in the United States that an election is the process by which 4 coyotes and a lamb vote on the lunch menu. Clearly, the coyotes are spenders and the lamb is a saver. And if you have 4 spenders and 1 saver, and they're voting on what the lunch menu is, the choice is fairly clear. And I think that's the circumstance that you've seen in New Zealand, and it's certainly the circumstance that you see in the U.S.
Yeah, I think it's a global issue that we have on our hands right now, obviously. So you mentioned about the government debt and stuff as well, and you said they want to reduce interest rates, and you think the Federal Reserve has dropped interest rates recently. They were quite resistant compared to some European countries and New Zealand, Australia, everywhere pretty much, even in India. What impact do you think that's happening? Because obviously there's the butting of heads going on between Trump and the central bank. The central bank, they say, is independent, but the president who loves debt, any president, in fact, I brought it up on the show before, in the US, I think the debt doubles every 8 years, regardless of whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president. So if the debt's going to keep going up, and the Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve is going to keep dropping interest rates, what do you think is happening to the long-term bonds?
I remember, I think it was Franz Pick that described the long-term bond as a certificate of guaranteed confiscation. The idea that you would own a maturity longer than 5 years, I don't own a maturity longer than 2 years, but the idea that you would own a maturity longer than 5 years at what I think is a negative real interest rate is crazy. I mean, let me explain to your audience my concept of negative real interest rates. And I'm sorry this is so U.S. centric, but I'm not as familiar with the New Zealand circumstance as I was when I lived.
No, but they'll get it.
In the U.S., we publish this thing called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. It's not a cost of living index. It's an artificial index If you believe the CPI, you suggest that American inflation is trotting along at 2.9%. Not attractive, but not catastrophic. And if you believe that 2.9% number, then you think the interest on the 10-year Treasury, 4.5, is okay. You're making 4.5 in a currency that's declining by 2.9 a year. So you're making 1.1, 1.2% positive yield. The problem is that the CPI should be referred to as the CPI. It's a joke. When it's inconvenient, it doesn't include food or fuel. If you took a full body shot of me right now, you could see that lunch is important to me. An index that doesn't include lunch is of no interest to me whatsoever. And the index has what they call hedonic adjustments, which is to say they measure the utility that they see in an item rather than its price. And laughably, the consumer price index doesn't include tax, the largest household expense of most Americans. I believe that the deterioration of the US dollar is proceeding along at a number closer to 8 than 2.9. And now the long bond comes clear. A 10-year bond pays you 4.5 in a currency that's declining by 8, which means that you're losing 3.5% of your purchasing power every year for 10 years. In other words, the U.S. government solemnly swears that if you give them $100,000, they will give you back $60,000 in purchasing power in 10 years. But of course, it gets worse. My belief is that the rate of deterioration of the U.S. dollar, which is a different way of saying inflation, will increase as opposed to decrease. That means that the capitalized value of your distribution from a bond, your interest payment, becomes worth less and less on a net present value basis. In the decade of the 70s, in addition to the fact that people lost 75% of the purchasing power that they enjoyed with the bond, they also lost principal. A 30-year U.S. Treasury bought in 1980 with an interest yield of 5.5%, lost 65% of its principal value in the decade 1970 to 1980. A truly, truly, truly ugly circumstance for people who chose to invest in what they perceived as a risk-free instrument.
The risk-free return, or the safest asset in the world, the U.S. Long bond, so to speak. But didn't that also happen during 2022, where that was a quick movement, obviously, in 2022, because after COVID, when they started increasing interest rates. And that was one of the reasons where, obviously, there were other reasons why some of the banks went under in the U.S. But obviously, a lot of the banks' balance sheets are kind of upside down because the Federal Reserve came out with this BTFP and said they don't need them to mark to market. That is another game that's being played behind the scenes.
I'm glad you mentioned that. You said a couple things there as a banker, which ought to be unpacked. First of all, time spread has killed more banks than any other form of stupidity. A time spread is taking advantage of the interest rate curve by lending long and funding it short. When the interest rate rises, the capitalized value of your bond holdings or mortgages falls at the same time that your cost to fund them increases. That's what brought down the U.S. savings and loan industry. It's what brought down Silicon Valley Bank. Why these morons keep doing it is beyond me. It's a pretty good business. The second thing that you talk about is the so-called mark-to-market. In banking in the U.S., we call that mark-to-myth. The way it works is this. If you have a portfolio of long-term debt securities on your balance sheet, you are allowed to say to the Fed, these are not trading positions. We're going to hold them to maturity. And as a consequence of that, you get to use the 30-year default rate, the long-term default rate, as a way to risk your portfolio. So you own a bond that's a 25-year bond. Let's say some great credit like Greece or India. And this bond is trading at the market at 60. Okay, that's what the market is paying for the bond. But you tell the Fed, well, it's not for sale. I'm holding it for 10 years. They allow you to mark that bond in your portfolio at par rather than at market, because they say it's not a trading position. So some of the great big banks, Bank of America, as an example, in the US, have, and I don't know the exact number, but numbers like $100 billion in unrealized losses in their balance sheet because of what the Fed calls mark to market and what some of us bankers call mark to myth.
It means we've never lived in a free market.
We haven't.
Never. We've never lived in a global free market. And that should shock you, right? Because you've heard things like capitalism is a free market or communism or then you're locked into a sense of purpose of who you are, an identity inside a control system that must stop the free market. So you're inside a zero-sum game, measuring everything from a zero-sum game, and you believe it's somebody else, right? And that belief that it's not you and it's somebody else is what gives the power to the control system. And so the control system, or put another way, let's break down the existing system, and that we've never lived in. But when money is lent into existence, so when you go to a bank, the money didn't exist. There's a false belief in the world that you're borrowing somebody else's money, they made money, but the money actually didn't exist when you go to the bank. They create the money when you take a loan, and you pay an interest rate on that money forever. And that perpetuates around the world. And that system where money is lent into existence must grow forever. You have to grow money forever. And so when people say deflation is bad, what they're actually talking about is deflation is bad from a credit-based system or a debt-based system, because deflation, which is really, really quite simple, I gain more value forever.
Yes.
Instead of I get value extracted forever, right? So if I gain more value forever in deflation, then the money that was lent into existence goes extinct. It goes to money heaven, right? And there is no more money. And so what is money in the first place? It's just an abstract concept for your time. And so if you lend money into existence and you build a kind of people in servitude to that money in essentially in chains, bound in chains to that money, they will stay stuck in that system and won't know. And so these two things, and so you could now draw two parallels out of this. An inflationary monetary system cannot allow deflation, because then you get Great Depression, or worse, every bank would fail. If you just kept allowing it, every bank would fail, everything would fail, the entire structure of society would fail. So a credit-based system or a debt-based system where money is lent into existence cannot allow deflation. And deflation is the natural state of a free market is deflation. So what I just did there right now, and for your audience, you might know this, but what I did for your audience is I set up two true statements, two factual statements that are in conflict with each other, right? And it sets up a cognitive dissonance in our brain, because we're trying to resolve what I said, which is the natural state of the free market, which a system that cannot allow it. So now we can go down both different systems, and we can understand why it is people get so confused, and why it might be them measuring from the wrong system, and what they can do about it over time. But ultimately that's the problem. Those two statements cannot coexist. Natural state. So, and you've never lived in a global free market. Some people have lived in a local free market, like the United States under the Constitution, for a time when everybody moved to the United States to take advantage of ideas and the United States became the most prosperous nation on the world, for a time that was the free market working, and that was around the Constitution, which gave. And why does that work? And why does that create prosperity, long-term prosperity? Because more ideas compete to provide value to other people.
Yeah, there's a good distinction you made there, and even saying that they're both facts, and the human mind struggles to comprehend them both. But as I've said on the show before, and to my audience as well, we weren't taught any of this at school for a reason. In fact, we've been taught the one way only, where inflation is normal. You're supposed to expect it, because if there's inflation, you also get a pay rise, and because it's just a natural phenomenon, supposedly, because that's not what they teach you in school. They don't teach you the way the system actually works. Well, they do teach you the way the system actually works based on their design, rather than, as you said, the way the free market should work. And you also quite nicely explained that debt has interest attached to it, and that is why they need to keep creating more money, which is why there's more inflation. Now, your book argues that deflation is the natural way, and if they build the system on inflation, which they don't want their system to collapse or break down, which one do you think wins in the longer term? Is that something that has to have a clean out every 80 or 100 years?
Yeah, so different question, and every reset of currency has always been actually the exact same thing. The global market has always been deflation, right? The global free market has always been deflation. And so when you're looking through all your history books and trying to pinpoint the root cause of the rise of wars and the destruction of societies, it's actually what I just described. Because the control system has to divide you, that there's some other enemy to retain zero-sum game, right? And typically what happens to us inside the control system is we vote for a different leader who divides us, and we take sides. And then when that can't be resolved from the same problem, creating the same problem, right? A system problem can't resolve a system problem. You have to create a greater enemy outside your borders and convince everybody it's their fault. And so you can see this in the way people are acting today, and all of the media they're consuming, and on both sides, on all sides, and they are inside that thing. And every once that even you even did it when it's the education system or it's this, we want to take sides within the system, blaming somebody else, when we ourselves aren't acting in accordance with the free market. What we are doing is all of our purchasing, everything else is inside that system, and we believe it's somebody else.
Okay. But the whole point is, if you're not taught any other way, you don't know better unless you go digging.
Yeah. So now let's pull on that thread a little bit. So what would you expect if I just had, and this is what I described in the book, that would happen, right? What would you expect is one system was trying to drive the free natural state of the free market, was trying to drive exponential abundance for you. Every year, even if you didn't work, you would get richer, right? As the world worked for because every single actor in the free market has to create more value than what came before, or they fail. So that means every single person is actually working for you.
Yeah.
Right. That's what it would look like, and prices would fall. And if you had 8 billion people in service of 8 billion people, you can imagine what we would come up with and how fast that abundance would flow to all of society. And I'm not saying entrepreneurs, the free market would work perfectly. Entrepreneurs would constantly find problems. Any single margin opportunity was a problem to provide more value. And they would attack them to be able to create more value for society. And the output of that, the prices would fall at a crazy rate. Now, from a credit-based system that can't allow that to happen, that exponential productivity must mean exponential capture of that productivity. So it's just it's a mirror image. And so the capture of that productivity from the inflationary monetary system means an exponential rise in debt, which you see evidence of it all around the world, which an exponential rise of control from the biggest powers who are most incented to that. An exponential rise of political process being captured, an exponential rise of laws changing to centralize and monitor all your speech, right? Patriot Act and everything else. And from that, and every centralized system is inside that thing, and all participants are inside that thing, screaming at the vortex inside the vortex. That's what, and they don't know that they don't know that all of their time is being farmed inside that. And if you realized what AI would do to you in that, if it was from within the control system, it would drive your belief that you made a difference inside that against somebody else's belief that they made a difference inside that, to keep it to have you believe that that's the way the world looked, that's the way the world looked. So that we'll get to Bitcoin in a second, or maybe in time.
Yeah, we'll come later. Yeah.
But that's, you could just forget Bitcoin for a moment. Just say, what would it look like if these two things were the way that society was built, and then technology was driving at the rate it's driving? It would look exactly as you would expect it, exactly as it looks today, and so all participants inside it would just be very confused because of what I just said.
Yeah. So let's just dig a little bit deeper, because in the book you describe a world where technological deflation, and you've covered a little bit, is not the enemy but the solution. I just wanted to go a little bit deeper to explain to our audience, what does an economy look like when deflation is finally embraced instead of fought?
It literally means the first global free market that has ever existed. So before we would go to war to steal somebody else's gold, or or to their raw materials. And what inside the country at the top, say the sun never sets on the British Empire, inside there, especially if you're at the very top of that system, it looked like it was a beautiful, beautiful world, right? But it relied on slavery around the world, that you put into slavery to extract their labor and talents and materials to capture. And then what ends up happening is, as that slavery sits and people get worse and worse and worse and worse, eventually you have a rise up of a different power that does the same thing, right? And this was the way the world's always looked. And you protected those powers through military might, always. And the military might was paid for by the extraction of more and more people,
And the free money printing.
And exactly, and they didn't know they were in that system, and it was always exactly the same system. So, and that's why we go to war, to fight that, and that both parties do the same thing. Then we reset currencies, like after World War II, Bretton Woods, we reset currencies. Okay, it's on gold. We will not cheat anymore. That works for about 30 years, and everybody gets, we build these massive institutions. Let's not forget, celebrate Remembrance Day, because we killed tens of millions of people. People go through a song and dance about nonsense, and the whole thing starts over again.
Yeah, of course, it's a cycle. Everything is cyclical, right?
And the cycle is, the first principle of the cycle is the natural state of the free market is deflation.
So why do you think, we've discussed this, that the powers that we don't want deflation, even in our rear view mirrors, they don't even want it to hit us as a thought. And that's why central banks say, no, deflation is very bad. And they keep blaming the Great Depression as, look, what happened in the Great Depression, because there's deflation. They don't tell us the truth why that happened.
Yeah. So the central bank is a construct of communism, right? Because if you can control money, you control all things downstream from money. And if you can control money, you control laws. You control everything, because money is superordinate to laws. So and people race after the money, and they're playing in an incentive game that is exactly the worst for human beings, because they will always chase the money. They always say, oh, I won't take the money, and they'll take the money, right? And and it creates this perverse incentive that people even if you didn't and everyone else did, you're a loser in that system, right? So it's really hard to escape when you have an abstract concept, money, that's really trade between humans, that's being manipulated. Then everybody inside that system is being manipulated and they don't know.
Yeah, it's a debt slavery system. Yeah.
It's literally a system that, so instead of saying people, I try to abstract this away because it's so easy to not see yourself in it. It's easy to see somebody else as the villain, right? Whether it's the government or today Carney or Trudeau before that in Canada, different people and different actors, would be Biden or Trump. But under all of these scenarios in every single country, you see, no matter who's leading, an exponential rise of debt, right? Which must mean, if the free market is naturally deflation, an exponential rise of control. Has to, right? So and let's imagine a leader that came out tomorrow and said, "Listen, jig's up. Whole thing was a mirage. Money is actually not there, right? We're going to allow the free market to work. And the cost of the free market working is every single bank is going to fail. All of your houses that you think are worth millions of dollars are zeros, right? And we're going to restart the board, right? Think that person would get elected?
No.
Exactly. So it's not them, it's us.
Because he's not lying, he's speaking the truth.
Exactly. We want to hear a bedtime story that we like, that matches our perception of reality. And most people's perception of reality is just that. It's a perception, is so far from the truth. And so they can't handle even what I'm saying right now. I'm sure you probably get comments that it can't be true, but when it is for sure true.
Let's start from the beginning. When you take a paper bill from that is printed in physical form, this paper bill used to be backed by gold and now is backed by nothing. In the banking system, this paper bill is a liability for the central bank. So when you take that paper and you deposit, so this is the best you can do today is backed by nothing, just confidence in a paper bill. That's the best you can do today. When you take that paper bill and you deposit it in a bank, you are now a creditor of the bank. Your money is not yours anymore. It belongs now to the bank, and the bank is now the creditor of the central bank. So already there, the banking system fails you because there is fractional reserve banking. They do not own one-to-one. They lend this money times and times again. In fact, some of the times, the reserve ratio, I think it used to be 8%. Now it's close to 0.
Yeah. In the US, they dropped it to almost 0 during COVID, didn't they?
Exactly. So it's basically printing to infinity. Okay. So already, and that's the point today. Even when your deposit in the bank is there, most of the times the banks or these stablecoin issuers, where you give them the dollar, they take that dollar and invest it in US Treasuries, which is basically a debt instrument that is guaranteed by the government. My opinion, if there's anybody you should not trust with your money, is the government. And I think everybody would agree with that. Yet, this is the system we're living in. Okay, so you're basically having the company's risk at the stablecoin issuers level. You have the systemic banking risk at the banking level, because you have bail-ins and all sorts of capital adequacy ratios. Today, you have more than 160 billion, if I'm not mistaken, of unmaterialized losses in the balance sheets of banks who hold those treasuries with higher interest rates, for which if they were to market them to market, they would be bust. And this is the case of all banks. And it is dangerous to say this because it can create crisis. This is information. This is not I'm not trying to push for bank runs, What I'm trying to say is informing people, and CEOs of banks know this. The third thing is those instruments are held to maturity in order not to be crystallized. But we've seen this with Silicon Valley Bank, where you had withdrawals. Any bank is broke if there was to run on a bank. That's why running on banks is forbidden, and they can close at any time and not open anytime. And the fourth thing is, it is now a time in history where, on top of that, you have a lot of politicization of money. So you have made the dollar political. You cannot use the dollar legally anywhere. If you are using the dollar with an enemy of the United States, and we don't know when is the next enemy going to be. It could be China, it could be India, it could be one of the major trade partners of your country. And it goes both ways. It goes for China, it goes for the United States. But they've politicized money. They've politicized the banking system, because the SWIFT now, who used to be neutral, has also cut off certain countries from their system. It started with Iran and Iraq, but it expanded to Russia, and it could be any other. Now, we also see, like I said, the digital ID, which I think there should be massive pushback as of today, as of this podcast, to remove this concept of tying up your identity to a government. The government has no right in your privacy, in your social freedom, and I don't think it should have any regards into your economic freedom. Of course, every country has their laws, and if you're breaking those laws, you should be held accountable. But that doesn't mean that we should go into a totalitarian regime where essentially everything is monitored, because that is a dystopia in my view. And I think if there is enough of a community that starts lobbying by voting with their foot, by voting with their wallet, and by voting with their actions, some politicians out there, as of now, will decide to run on the program to make a democracy a direct democracy, and to abolish some of the freedom overreach that the government has done.
This is something you mentioned in there, my digital ID. Obviously, in the UK, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer comes on and he says you cannot have a job unless you have a digital ID. You said something about travel as well. We have passports for travel. We already have driver's licenses. Most citizens already have tax file numbers for their countries. So it doesn't even meet the common sense test anymore. But they're still so authoritarian that they keep pushing the whole digital ID. And I've mentioned this when I get interviewed quite often: problem, reaction, solution. They create the problem, they open the borders, they get people in, then they see the public reaction, and they're like, oh, there's too many immigrants in our country. And the solution is digital ID, which I think was it Tony Blair, and he's been talking about this since the 2000s to try and get a digital ID in the UK. And obviously, while Keir Starmer is already unpopular, he's the one who tries and pushes this. I remember during COVID, you couldn't go out and have a coffee or get a haircut or even meet your friends if you didn't have the vaccine passport, which is a digital ID, but for vaccines. And now they're going down there. Why do you think at least 85 or 90% of the population doesn't get it, that the digital ID is no good? It has no use cases, but they're still gobbling them up for convenience. It's always sold as convenience.
Look, I am also very puzzled, because you look at what happened in Canada during COVID, or so many other places where they could literally cut you off of the payment system based on whether or not you were vaccinated. So it is really a dystopian idea, like you said. Problem, reaction, solution. I think a lot of people are awakening to this, because essentially it doesn't matter what the problem is. The agenda is like, because of XYZ, we need to have digital ID. I don't know if most of people are still brainwashed or are NPCs. I don't know if you need to go into the fringe conspiracy theories where the vaccinated people are now like under control of 5G. I don't think this is. I think the only thing one needs to look at is, at the very least, we need to establish the respect of individual freedoms. If you want to have digital ID, fair enough, go ahead and do it. But you shouldn't be forced and coerced into having the digital ID, because, you know, I think it was in a movie when you had the 10th man rule, where you always have to have one person not to follow the same ideas, just in case everybody else is wrong. And if you put everybody in the same basket and there is no exception, when digital ID goes wrong, when God knows the AI Skynet takes over, what are we gonna do? It doesn't seem like a very prudent thing to me. Um, I am hopeful that there will be countries, particularly in the South, who will refuse these sort of things. And then, naturally speaking, some of these countries who do the right things will thrive more than others, because um, economic and social liberty is always the ones that win. So, so long as not all of the world does that, and so long as there is freedom in leaving, um, because that's the big problem with North Korea, is that you can't leave. So, we're getting there. Um, the the availability for people to travel and to vote with their feet. I'm not against migration myself. I am an immigrant here in Switzerland. Uh, but I am against welfare, meaning that if you move somewhere, you don't have to be supported in any shape or form, but yourself. Um, but that's a little bit more of a political topic. The bottom line is, uh, freedom in all of its aspects should be preserved and should be looked at. And I feel today that this is the danger. We've seen it with COVID. I think a lot of people have waken up, but apparently not enough, because this trend of digital ID, and we see it happening at the same time. We have a vote here in Switzerland. We had the imposition of it without asking any mandate. Who gave the mandate to the Prime Minister of England to establish this? Nobody's voted for it. And I'm pretty sure that if you were to ask most people, giving them their consent and their informed consent, uh, they would refuse. COVID was not an informed consent, and that's a tragedy. And I feel like we're doing this again.
Yeah, exactly why I brought up COVID. It wasn't informed consent, and if you did not take the magic shot or whatever, then you couldn't work or you lost friends. And I know, because I'm a New Zealand citizen, what happened in New Zealand and countries like Australia. I've heard stories where people had to lose jobs. Some people actually lost their houses because they couldn't afford to pay their mortgage because they lost their jobs. So it's like governments get really authoritarian. They tried this a few years back, and now with the digital ID, and as you said, nobody's asked for it, but their overlords, whoever it is, whether it's the World Economic Forum or whether it's some other organization driving policy or the UN or whatever, they just seem to follow. And more so in the West, I was saying, because the economic system is collapsing. But just recently, in the space of a month, Thailand and Vietnam have both shut down their citizens' bank accounts. I think 86 million bank accounts, was it in Thailand or Vietnam, where you have to submit your digital ID. And last year I brought it up, it happened in Bahrain as well. So we can see this happening in the East and the West, just like it happened in COVID. You could just see most countries did the exact same brain dead policies. So there's a bigger global agenda behind all of this, isn't it?
Absolutely. So, Farzin, what is the solution? Okay. The solution is to opt out. Okay. The solution will, in my view, will either be civil disobedience when these totalitarian pushes go too far, because people will have enough of this. That's number one. Or second, just have the options that are available. Today, I think that pushing towards that will only exacerbate other solutions that will push people to opt out of the traditional banking systems, such as blockchain, to have more anonymity and to have more, private property so that they do not participate in the system. So at the end of the day, I think more solutions like mine will be a signal to prove that people do not want political money, that people want real money that preserves its value over centuries and millennia, and that in which governments have no say in it. The more movements can prove this, and I think Bitcoin and the crypto industry, the native one, is pushing towards that. I believe in the force of private sector. I believe in the force of human initiative to push back with solutions that will prove that the more you push towards a centralized totalitarian regime, the more people will reject the type of money that they're being offered, the more people will reject the type of financial services that they're offered, and the more they will reject the fake democracy that they're offered. And so eventually, truth will prevail.
What's your view on the US government being able to get out of this debt problem, or it's just 2 minutes to midnight?
It's 2 minutes to midnight. There's really no way to get out of a debt this large. It's a friend of mine that's very studied and taught me a lot, and I think he's learned things from me as well. But the idea that he took on one summer was, what happens in this type of a system? Does it go into a debt liquidating depression, or does it go into a hyperinflationary blow-off? And what he discovered through study that whole summer on that one question was, every time that the currency was not tied to gold or gold and silver, you went into a inflationary blow-off. If it was tied to gold, like in the 30s, you could go into a debt liquidating depression, which is what the 30s was. Money became more valuable, but the money was gold. They revalued gold and try to boost the system that way. But even by boosting the system that way, it still didn't really get them out of the problem. The problem of the Great Depression, and there's different views on this, and I've heard most of them, but my take is that it was World War II that really brought us, meaning the United States, out of the Great Depression. So it's a very sad situation when you wake up to it. Not that we can't do better, we can, but there's got to be truth in the system, and to pretend that we could get something for nothing is the biggest lie ever told. As I like to say, I don't know if I coined it or not, doesn't matter. I think it's profound, but your audience can decide. But when you can lie about money, you can lie about anything, because money transcends everything. It transcends our nationalities. You're in India or New Zealand. I'm in America. We both need it. It transcends religion, sexual orientation, what sports team you like, what color is your favorite. It transcends all that stuff. No matter what part of the world you're in, unless you're, tribal situation, you need to have money in order to live. We're the only species on the planet. We've got all the stuff we need, but yet we've put into place, to our detriment, this controlling the mechanism that favors the very few at the top, that dictate to us what we do with our labor. And with our labor, we get these tokens, and these tokens are quote unquote valuable, when in reality, they're not worth much at all.
They're not. It's just a piece of toilet paper, if you ask me, with the number 100 and the name of whatever central bank of the country you're living in. But you touched a few good points, David, there, because obviously money should be a utility. It should be something that is good for humans, and obviously it was something just to transact. Because of barter back in the days, it was too cumbersome. So obviously money was created first, whether it was shells and now it's paper currency. So obviously it's a medium of exchange, but I remember they also used to tell us money also serves the purpose of savings. And this is where people aren't understanding. If you save in the normal fiat currency, you're actually going backwards, even if you do nothing wrong, because the inflation, at least the true inflation, is higher than what even the government tells us. So we're going backwards without doing anything. do you think people in America, especially obviously with Trump coming in, there was obviously it wasn't just inflation, but do you think the high inflationary numbers in the US had an impact on Trump coming in and people saying enough is enough? Obviously, there were other factors as well, but do you think people in the US are feeling the inflation still?
Oh yeah, people in America are definitely feeling inflation. It's apparent to, top to bottom pretty much. I mean, the rich obviously have got enough that they can, weather the storm, whether gas is at $4 or $5 or $6 a gallon. But the guy and gal just working for a living, if their commute to work goes from $4 a gallon to $6 a gallon, they look at their budget, it might not be worth driving or, whatever. So it hurts everyone, some more than others. I mean, unfortunately, inflation hurts the middle class on down more than it hurts the, upper middle class up. It hurts everyone. It's just living a lie. And it's something that, has taken place again and again and again. And here we are, where it's global. And I want to talk a little bit about the debt. I mean, the 37 trillion is a big number. It cannot be paid off mathematically. So I just told you a moment ago that it'll probably be inflated away, which means when you give up on the currency, and no one knows when, before that happens, I truly believe a new system will be pushed on us with some type of a central bank digital currency, or maybe a private currency. Maybe there'll be the JPM, token or whatever. It's obvious that the powers that be are very big on tokenization. I wrote about that in the Morgan Report. I don't know, it's been probably about 8 months ago, how they're for real loan for a deposit banking system where you actually do deposit money in. That's a different system than what we have, but that's a collateral-based system. And if you tokenize all the blades of grass, all the water, all the rocks, all the mountains, all the valleys, and all the fields in America with a token, guess what? You can probably run the scam longer, because now you have collateral that's worth, I don't know, pick a number, $100 trillion worth of land and, and plants and animals in America. When our debt's only 37 trillion. See? We're collateralized. And now it's a mind game more than anything else. But I think that may be one of the quote unquote solutions that could be, pushed out on the public. I don't know for sure. I do think about these things, obviously. But that's the idea, is to maintain their power and control. To them, the money is almost irrelevant, because the debt of 37 trillion can't be paid back, and they know it. And it's the debtor that's servant to the lender. So as long as you are in debt, they have control. And that was brought out in a movie called The International. And I agree with it, that even though you and I would care about the principal, if you made a loan to your brother-in-law or your sister or a bank, any kind of loan, you don't want your interest and your money back. For them, since they could print money to infinity, all they really care about is, can you make the interest payment? Because if you can't make the interest payment or not, guess what, Venezuela, we get your oil. Guess what, Argentina, we get your silver. Guess what, Mexico, we get your oil. I'm cutting through a lot of details, but that's kind of the bottom line of how it works. You loan them money, they can't pay it back. Well, guess what? We'll make it. Well, you made the money for nothing, and you're getting oil for it. Who's the winner in that?
Exactly. That was, I think that's a scenario from the actual book by John Perkins, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman as well.
Yeah, John's an awesome guy.
Yeah. But that was to do with countries. The same thing they're doing with us, as you just mentioned. I don't know if the audience picked up on it. They're stealing our labor for nothing. They create money out of thin air. They deposit it into your bank account. You pay taxes and you're a tax slave for the rest of your life. And then they tell you could retire at the age of 65, which also then gets taxed. I don't know if you know, but in Australia, the government wants to tax spare bedrooms. So if you have a big enough house and you don't have bedrooms being used, they actually want to tax your spare bedroom. That's how ridiculous it's getting in some of these Western democracies. I won't even call them democracies anymore. It's getting ridiculous where the people have actually paid off all their debt and have wealth. They want to impoverish them as well.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, I think 2026 is going to be the 25th anniversary of 9/11. So a few listeners might be going, well, why are you still talking about that? Well, for several reasons, but one of the key ones is it's going to remain and always will remain a great case study because it contained the impossible. But I would say both 9/11 and COVID-19 have one thing in common. Well, probably a lot more than one, but the key thing is back to inversion again, Farzin, because to understand 9/11, you have to understand the war on terror wasn't a result of 9/11. 9/11 was a result of the desire for the war on terror and everything else that came with it. And it's the same with COVID-19. The control measures were not introduced because of the virus. The virus was released as an excuse to introduce the control measures and subsequently the mRNA bioweapon. So when you flip things on the head, you can see them more clearly. But 9/11 is sort of fascinating because of a few things, including the level of complexity, because there were so many moving parts with this thing. And so when you step back and go, okay, where do I start with this and what is it about? And one of the things that hit me was the fact that there was a lot of arguments going on in the truth community. You know, was it this? Did they do that? Blah, blah, blah. So everyone was getting sort of trapped in the weeds and the minutiae. And so I took a step back and went, okay, what's the approach here? And I realized that proving what didn't happen was a much lower bar than proving what did happen. Because you could see all these people arguing about the detail and going, yeah, but you all agree on one thing, and that is that the official narrative is a bunch of lies. And the interesting thing with 9/11 is it's not only a bunch of lies, but the lies contain the impossible. And it's rare to get a false flag attack where you can absolutely say certain things within the official narrative are impossible. And it was certainly the case with 9/11. And one of the key things with that was actually the story of the planes hitting the two towers. Because when you go to, again, it's a bit like the monetary system, Farzin. I realized early on that technical explanations don't really convince anyone, which is massively disappointing as a truth seeker. Because the tendency is to go, well, look, there's a proof and there's a technical proof. And people just don't wrap their head around technical details very well. It's just how we are.
Yeah, because we're emotional creatures, right? Energy and emotions, and they create fear. So people stop thinking for themselves. The same thing with 9/11 and the pandemic. So carry on, Fergus.
So again, I think, well, we know humans best react to stories, right? So I think interviewing people who should know what they're talking about is at least a start, right? So when I was looking at the plane angle, it turns out that whatever hit the Twin Towers, it could not have been the original two airliners. Why? Well, for several reasons. One, as Ben Eady, an aeronautical engineer, explained, he said, no, it's impossible. You need so much power to push yourself through the air. So let's rewind slightly, Farzin. So imagine I asked you to run 100 meters. And the first one is on an athletics track, and the other one is through a lake of treacle. You're not going to be able to run through the lake of treacle at the same speed as you can the athletic track, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because the frictional forces are massive compared to air. Well, the same occurs when you're flying a plane at low level and high level. So commercial airliners can go at 580 miles an hour, but at 38,000 feet. They cannot do that speed at, say, 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet because the density of the air. So the guy's saying basically you would need an aircraft with 6 times the thrust to be able to drive it at that speed through that air density. So then they ask other people and they said the same. But the one that really stood out for me is someone actually rang up Boeing and spoke to a spokesperson there called Leslie Hazard. And he said, yeah, it's to do with the maximum speed of a 767-200 at 700 feet altitude. You go, yeah, for 200? Yeah, for a 767-200. So there's no way it could be going at 500 miles an hour at 700 feet altitude then. A response was, ha, 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 not a chance. Now, when you've got a Boeing spokesperson laughing down the phone at you at the idea that it could even be going at that speed, at that altitude, I think that is more convincing than most of the other technical explanations. But of course, it doesn't stop there because the maximum operating velocity for that plane was around 400 miles an hour. Why? Because after that, there's a risk of bits falling off the plane. Except this was supposedly going nearly 200 miles faster than that and not having a problem. And the third biggest problem, even if you ignore those two, is you get things like turbulence effects like Dutch roll. So they actually got a load of experienced pilots and tried in a simulator to get them to hit the Twin Towers going at that speed. Guess what? None of them could do it. And we're meant to believe that someone who couldn't even fly a tiny aircraft, a Cessna, very well, is able to direct this thing when professional pilots can't do it. So when you add all that together, I believe it can't possibly have been the original airliners. And then we can get into stuff like, well, what was it? But we've already demolished the official narrative at that point, and that's all you need to do, really.
Yeah,
Makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And the funny thing is, I would just like to highlight to people also, I think it was only 2 months or 3 months back. I obviously knew about this already, but just 2 or 3 months back, I don't know if people might have seen this, but there was a plane that took off from an Indian airport and literally a kilometer or two away ended up crashing into a school or something along those lines. And you should see the condition of that plane. It was not in a good condition, and it was only a 3-story building, and the plane was left worse off than the building, I can tell you that. So the whole explanation that those planes flew at that speed into the Twin Towers, and not only that, Fergus, the whole thing is how they collapsed the buildings, right? There was a fire on those floors on the top. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because people did die, but for me, common sense is not so common. Like, you should just use your common sense and look at it. Obviously, time helps because you're not that emotional about it. But I had come across, I think, 2006, 2007, across a documentary on YouTube where they take you through certain reasons why the whole thing was a lie. And even the engineers who actually, the structural engineers said the building structure was designed to take plane hits. Even if it was a plane, it could not have collapsed. And you could see the demolition bids going off on the lower floors. And again, one thing you do mention in your book is about World Trade, the WTC 7 building, which nobody talks about. The other thing people don't talk about is the Pentagon, where supposedly the exact room that was hit was where, and I think I mentioned this when I was interviewed once before, was the exact building where all the paperwork was kept when Ronald Rumsfeld, I think, was being chased for, I think, quite a few $1 trillion of missing money for the government.
At the time, I think.
Yeah, so obviously people like us might know about these things, but as you said, the war on terror, right? The one thing that I was going to mention there, and I think is always problem, reaction, solution. The same thing I said with COVID. They already have a solution ready. They need to create the problem, get the people to react, and then they have a solution ready. And then the next one, which is the central bank digital currency or the one world currency or one world government, they already have a solution ready. They need to create the problem reaction to get us there.
Yeah, well, you'd like, because were you aware that, for example, the Patriot Act that was brought in very soon after 9/11 was actually written in the years before?
Yeah. Yeah.
So say they've already got it lined up, there you go, right? I think one of the one thing I'd say about the Twin Towers, which is where I tend to start with the explanation, and there's a quote from Philip K. Dick. Said the basic tool of manipulation of reality is the manipulation of words. If you can control the meaning of words, you can control the people who must use those words. And all you have to do is change the word collapse to disintegrate. Because if you watch what happened, the buildings didn't collapse, they disintegrated. They basically turned to dust. And whenever you get, when you're doing controlled demolitions, for example, you always end up with a heap of rubble at the bottom. Well, the heap of rubble on the Twin Towers was only about a quarter the size it should have been if everything had collapsed and ended up in a pile. The fact that that actually turned to dust in itself shows you where part of the problem lies. And I think for most people, they can see that with their own eyes without having to go into any technical explanations.
Yeah, and the one thing I just remembered when you mentioned that, Fergus, the one thing I wasn't aware of was all of this rubble was shipped off quite quickly off the site into some other country. Do you just want to share that? Because I wasn't aware of that one. So you could not look into the actual demolished stuff to see what was in it.
So anytime you have a crime scene and you're removing evidence from the crime scene, that's a massive red flag, right? I mean, the latest one, I believe, was Charlie Kirk, where they concreted over the area 4 days after the incident.
Yeah.
It's like, you're always looking for discrepancies, like of, well, what's the standard protocol in any investigation and what are they actually doing? And as soon as you get things like that, it's being deliberately covered up. And that was the same with a lot of the metal. It was all shipped to China. I mean, it took a few months, but why do you ship off the evidence while you're still trying to do the investigation? It doesn't make sense unless you want to cover up what's happened, which is obviously why they did it, right?
It was really interesting what COVID threw up for us. I don't know if New Zealand was any different again from those other like countries that I just mentioned, but I learned a lot about, well, I had confirmed, it's probably a better way of putting, because I always suspected there was something in the national psyche. But it showed me that I wasn't so far out in thinking these things anymore, because I was looking at the behavior of people reacting to it, and I could see none of it made sense. And like I said before, the more it doesn't make sense, the more curious I get about it. And, you talk about rabbit holes, probably not a good term to use anymore. I don't know, maybe we can use it in reverse, because there are all sorts of rabbit holes. But you follow the direction of things, right? And sometimes you're cut off really early. There's nothing there. You realize that. You push further, and I suppose you've got to be smart enough to work out where you've overreached in what you're thinking, and being too conspiratorial or too suspicious, or it's a nuanced thing. I think a lot of people are working those things out. So I don't mind going down rabbit holes, actually. In fact, someone needs to.
Yeah, it's not even
Just to either confirm or deny. And if it's deny, that's fine. If that's the truth.
Or as the show is called, it's not just the rabbit hole, as the show is called, connecting the dots, right?
Well, there you go. Let's use that term.
Yeah, you pull out enough of the dots and then you start connecting them. You go, this doesn't make sense. And then you're looking for more coincidences and dots to connect. So since you brought up COVID, obviously I've mentioned this on when you've interviewed me on Money Talks. I could see before the fact that there was some event coming which was going to be triggered from a financial perspective. So let's start off with COVID, right? Where did you see what was happening in New Zealand, or where did you try and first figure out or see signs that something wasn't right or didn't meet the sniff test, so to speak?
Well, I was on it early because we started reporting it as a news story as soon as kind of the trickle at first of the story broke. So I knew about that. And then I saw the ramping up because I was in news, radio news. So I saw it ramping up from just that little trickle through to this, industrial level, military grade, every day, the totals of how many people have tested positive and things like that. And, the fear thing was coming on. So I could sort of see it going somewhere. And then we had the benefit in New Zealand of a slight delay. What was happening overseas was happening earlier to them than us. So we kind of got to see that. But then as it became more crazy, that's when I started to think, when they're starting to talk about locking people down and things like that, how are we going to afford this?
It's called the printing press.
Well, I've found out more since then. But, if economic activity and the normal flow of activity is constrained, it won't take long before, business is really affected. And turnover is a great thing. So that starts to grind to a halt. You know that there are problems. And then, of course, that's when you start to hear, well, about quantitative easing already from the US and what they've been doing. But you realize, that's the plan. Then you think, even if you're not very bright like me, well, what happens when all that money floods in? There's no productivity going on. No one's using goods or services except for online purchasing and delivery or whatever. And many people had to rely on those things. Of course, they were scared as well, so that a lot of them didn't want to go out of the house. So when that money comes in, and I'm no genius, Farzin, but then what I thought would happen happened. Suddenly the house prices, because I was living in Auckland, so it's in our face all the time there. Suddenly people couldn't believe it. It was like a heaven. It was like a nirvana. You're at home. You don't have to work. But there's all this cheap money at, what was the interest rate? It was 1% or 1.75.
Yeah, I think it had dropped to ridiculous levels, right? Make the money as cheap as you can.
And so what do you think's going to happen? Of course, none of it went into any sort of productive area at all. And here we all are now figuring out how, grandkids and great-grandkids are going to end up paying for this eventually if you're ever going to pay down a debt. So, yeah, I think we're still probably going to zoom back even more to see what a total disaster the whole thing was from every freaking angle,
Yeah, I agree, Matt. As I mentioned before, problem, reaction, solution.
Yeah.
This is a 10-year game that they have already planned a collapse, and COVID was the first part of it. Obviously, there had to be some event for them to flood the system as the banking system was going down. So they shut down economies and said, it's okay, we're just trying to keep you safe. We'll give you the money.
If you look over to where we are doing the stuff, it misdirection completely.
Oh, of course it is. And it's just because of a virus which is no worse than the flu, or a little bit worse than the flu, if you believe the statistics, so to speak. And to be quite honest, right, they had they had the state set. They had all the right politicians in the right places who were just going to do exactly as they were told. And I think that is where people still haven't seen through that. It didn't matter what political party was in what country. Everything was there's a document out there called lockstep. Everything was in lockstep and every country was going the same direction. In our winter, we were locking up, and summer, supposedly, we were opening up again. And even people who were given the magic injection, they were getting COVID. And I still think people haven't connected the dots there, that it's not the magic injection that actually saved them. There wasn't something that threatening. Do you want to first talk about the political drama side of it? As I said, they're all puppets. They are just going to be doing what they have to do.
What I was going to say is, as you're talking there, it reminded me. I was talking to Andrew Bridgen the other day, the British MP, who's quite well known for his activities. He's been supporting Rainer Fulmick recently, but of course he was kicked out of the Tory party, and things have been tough for him. But he was telling the story of how far this goes back. So Tony Blair, this is what Andrew said to me. He said, why do you think Tony Blair took the death penalty off treason in 1998? And that's like 98. That's like almost 30 years ago. And that's just one example. But also here in New Zealand, legislation was changed well in advance to allow or create the framework for then what was deployed in some cases, the gap between what actually eventually happened and, foundations put in place, is a decade. So it goes, it's an intergenerational project.